The rope had been there since noon, looped loose around his waist, tethered to a fence post baking under the summer sun. Nobody stopped. Cars slowed, then kept driving. Douglas sat there, sweat gathering at his hairline, humming to keep himself calm, waiting for a sound he knew, his uncle's truck, the only thing that meant this would end. Then a different sound rolled down the street, deep, slow. A motorcycle easing to a stop right across from the mailbox. The rider didn't speak at first. He just stared at the rope, then at the boy's wrist, raw and red where it rubbed. Something in his face changed. "How long you been sitting out here?" Douglas answered honestly. He always did. What that stranger did next would reach 700 people by sunrise, and none of them, including him, could have predicted where it would end. Douglas Whitaker knew the sound of his uncle's truck before it turned the corner. The engine had a low rattle, like a cough that never quite cleared. And every afternoon at 4 o'clock, Douglas sat on the porch step of the small house on Birchwood Lane and listened for it. Some days it came right on time. Other days it didn't come until the streetlights buzzed on, and Douglas would count the lampposts up and down the block to keep his mind steady while he waited. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with a gentle round face, and eyes that crinkled easily when something made him laugh. He had lived with his uncle, David Sanders, for 6 years, since his mother passed away, and no one else had been willing to take him in. David worked 2 jobs, mornings at a hardware warehouse outside Asheville, evenings driving deliveries for a grocery chain. And the arrangement at first had seemed manageable. Manageable things fray at the edges when nobody is watching closely enough. Douglas liked routines. He liked the yellow bowl he ate cereal from, the way he folded his socks before bed, and the little garden gnome he'd named Charlie near the mailbox. He liked Tuesdays, when the recycling truck came early and made a satisfying crunch lifting the bins. He did not like when routines broke, and lately they had been breaking more and more. David had lost his afternoon caregiver support 2 months earlier. The county program that once sent someone to sit with Douglas between shifts had been cut for budget reasons, and no one explained what that meant until the check stopped. He called 4 agencies. 2 never called back. 1 quoted a price higher than his weekly paycheck. The last had a waiting list, 11 months long. So David improvised, the way exhausted people do when they run out of good options and are left with only worse ones. At first, he left Douglas inside with the television on and the doors locked, checking in by phone every hour. But 3 weeks ago, Douglas had wandered out during a thunderstorm, terrified and disoriented, and a neighbor found him soaked and shivering 2 streets over, unable to explain where he'd been trying to go. After that, David panicked. He told himself it would only be for a few hours, just until he found something better. He looped a length of nylon rope around Douglas's waist and tied the other end to the fence post by the mailbox, giving him enough slack to sit on the porch step and reach a cooler of water and snacks. It was, in David's mind, a desperate compromise between the boy he loved and a world that offered him no real support to keep him safe. Douglas did not fully understand why the rope was there. He knew it made his wrist itch where the rope rubbed, and he knew that sitting in the sun for hours made his head hurt by the time the truck came home. He did not have the words to describe what he felt as embarrassment exactly, but he understood that when cars slowed down on the street, the people inside looked at him strangely, and he had started keeping his eyes down when he heard tires on gravel. On a Thursday in early June, with the temperature climbing past 90 degrees, Douglas sat on the step, sweat gathering at his hairline, the rope looped loosely around his waist and tethered to the weathered fence post. He hummed a tune from a cartoon he liked, tapping his fingers against his knee to keep the rhythm, trying to make the afternoon pass faster. That was when he heard the motorcycle. It wasn't loud in an angry way. It was a deep, rolling sound, the kind that made the porch boards hum faintly under his sneakers. Douglas looked up and saw a big man on a black and chrome motorcycle slow at the end of Birchwood Lane. then eased the bike to a stop directly across from the mailbox. The man wore a faded leather vest over a grey t-shirt, and patches Douglas couldn't read from that distance were stitched along the front. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a head of greying hair pulled back loosely, and sat there for a long moment, simply staring. Douglas lifted a hand in a small, uncertain wave. It was something people did on his street, and he liked doing it, because sometimes people waved back. The man did not wave back right away. Instead, he swung his leg off the bike, set the kickstand, and walked closer, his boots crunching over the gravel shoulder of the road. Douglas watched him come, unsure whether to feel excited or afraid. As the man got closer, his eyes moved from Douglas's face down to the rope at his waist, then to the fence post where it was tied off, and something in his expression changed, the polite curiosity hardening into something sharper, quieter, more focused. "Hey there," the man said, stopping a respectful few feet away, his voice low and even, like he was talking to someone he didn't want to startle. "My name's Raymond." "What's yours?" "Douglas," he said, and offered the small, crinkling smile that came so easily to him. "I like your motorcycle. It's loud." "It sure is," Raymond said, the corner of his mouth lifting despite the tightness still in his jaw. His eyes flicked again to the rope. "You mind if I ask you something, Douglas? How long you been sitting out here?" Douglas considered the question seriously, the way he considered most questions, turning it over before answering. "Since after lunch," he said. "Uncle David comes home when the streetlights turn on, sometimes." Raymond nodded slowly, and something settled behind his eyes. Not shock exactly, more like a decision being made. He crouched down to Douglas's level, careful and unhurried, and looked at the rope more closely without touching it yet. "Is that all right with you?" Raymond asked. "Being tied up like that?" Douglas shrugged, the gesture small and practiced, as if the question had never quite been asked of him before in a way that expected a real answer. "It itches," he admitted, holding up his wrist to show the faint red mark. "And it's hot." Raymond looked at that mark for a long moment, and Douglas noticed his jaw tighten again, though his voice stayed gentle. "Well, Douglas," Raymond said finally, "how about we get you some water first, and then I'm going to make a call. That all right with you?" Douglas nodded, and for the first time in weeks felt something loosen in his chest that he did not yet have a name for. Raymond Coleman had ridden with the Blue Ridge Riders for 11 years, ever since a rough stretch following his divorce, when a friend suggested that a motorcycle club might give him something to belong to besides regret. He was 47 now, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet, weathered face that made strangers assume he'd seen more of life's hard edges than he let on, which was mostly true. He worked as a foreman at a construction supply yard on the edge of town, and he rode on weekends and any evening the weather allowed. He was not, by his own description, a sentimental man. But something about the boy on the porch step, his easy wave, his patient answer about the rope, the small, hopeful way he'd said sometimes, had lodged itself somewhere in Raymond's chest and would not let go. He got Douglas a bottle of water from his saddlebag first, watched him drink it in 3 long gulps, and then, working carefully so as not to hurt him, untied the rope from the fence post, though he left it looped loosely at Douglas's waist rather than pulling it free entirely, some instinct telling him not to alter things too quickly before understanding the full situation. Then he pulled out his phone. His first call was not to the police. It was to Marcus Webb, the president of his riding chapter, a retired firefighter who had a level head and knew half the emergency responders in the county by name. "Marcus," Raymond said, keeping his voice low and steady so as not to alarm Douglas, who was watching him with open curiosity from the step. "I need you to get some people together. I found something on Birchwood Lane you're not gonna like." Within 20 minutes, 3 more motorcycles rolled up outside the house. Marcus Webb on his touring bike, a woman named Pamela Reyes, who worked as a hospice nurse and rode with the chapter on weekends, and a younger rider named Jeffrey Anders, who ran a landscaping business and had 2 kids of his own. They didn't crowd Douglas. Pamela knelt a respectful distance away and introduced herself gently, asking if he was hungry, if his skin hurt anywhere, if he wanted to sit in the shade. Marcus made a second call, this one to the Buncombe County Department of Social Services, and a third to a local non-profit called Second Family Support Network that connected caregivers of adults with disabilities to respite resources. It was Marcus who eventually called 911, calm and precise, describing what they'd found without exaggeration or accusation. A young man tethered outside in extreme heat, apparently for hours at a time, with no immediate caregiver present. Within the half hour, a patrol car and a caseworker from social services arrived. Douglas grew nervous at the uniforms, his hands twisting together until Raymond crouched beside him again. "You're not in trouble," Raymond said. "None of this is your fault. You understand me." Douglas studied his face for a long moment, the way he did when he was deciding whether to trust something. "Okay," he said finally. "Are you going to leave now?" "No," Raymond said, and he meant it more firmly than he expected to. "I'm not going anywhere." David Sanders arrived home 40 minutes later to find his driveway crowded with motorcycles, a patrol car, and a woman in a county badge speaking quietly with his nephew on the porch. His face went the color of old paper. He stumbled through an explanation before anyone even asked. The lost caregiver program, the 11-month wait list, the thunderstorm 3 weeks back, the fact that he hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night in 2 months trying to hold 2 jobs and a household together alone. He wasn't defensive so much as hollowed out, a man who had run out of every option he knew how to reach for. The caseworker, a measured woman named Diane Whitfield, did not immediately separate them. She listened, took notes, and explained that while the situation could not continue as it was, her first priority was finding a sustainable path that didn't simply punish a man who was drowning. It was to build a raft. She scheduled a follow-up home visit for the next week and connected David, on the spot, with an emergency respite care voucher through the county, something he hadn't known existed because no one had ever told him to ask. Raymond didn't leave that evening, not really. He sat on the porch step with Douglas while the adults talked, and when Douglas asked what 700 meant, he'd overheard Marcus say something about activating the phone tree, could be 700 people by morning. Raymond explained, in the plainest terms he could manage, that the Blue Ridge Riders weren't just a club. They were part of a larger regional network of riding chapters across 3 states, connected by a phone and message tree built originally for charity runs and disaster relief. When something like this happened, a kid in trouble, a family in crisis, someone who needed help fast, one call could ripple outward until it reached 700 people within a day, all of them ready to show up with money, muscle, meals, or simply presence. 700 people, Douglas repeated slowly, turning the number over like he did with everything important. That's a lot of people. It sure is, Raymond said, and near about all of them are going to know your name by tomorrow. Douglas smiled at that, the first real smile Raymond had seen from him that hadn't been layered with nerves. "I never had 700 friends before," he said. "Well," Raymond said, feeling something shift and settle in his chest, "looks like you do now." Before Raymond left that night, he asked David directly whether he could come by again, not to check up on him exactly, though that was part of it, but because he wanted to know Douglas better, and because it was clear the family could use an extra set of hands that didn't come with judgment attached. David, still shaken and ashamed, agreed almost too quickly, as if he'd been waiting years for someone to offer help without conditions. Word moved fast through the phone tree that night, the way Marcus had promised it would. By morning, Raymond's phone held 43 messages, offers of yard work, meal deliveries, a retired nurse willing to do respite shifts twice a week, a lawyer offering free consultation on guardianship and benefits questions, and a dozen more riders simply asking, "What's the kid's name? What's the address? What's the plan?" Raymond sat at his kitchen table before sunrise, coffee cooling beside him, and began sorting the messages into something like order. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt genuinely necessary to something larger than himself. The days that followed were not simple ones. A local television station picked up the story after a neighbor posted a photo of the motorcycles parked outside the house on Birchwood Lane, and within 48 hours, the comments beneath the article had split into two loud opposing camps. Some called for David Sanders to be arrested and for Douglas to be removed from his home permanently. Others insisted the whole thing was overblown, that a rope on a porch wasn't cruelty, just a poor man's improvised babysitting. Douglas did not read any of it, but he noticed that David had started flinching every time his phone buzzed, and he noticed his uncle's hands shaking slightly when he poured his coffee in the mornings. He noticed, too, that strangers sometimes stopped their cars slowly in front of the house, phones raised, and that Raymond had taken to standing on the porch during those moments, arms crossed, until the cars moved along. Diane Whitfield, the caseworker, returned for her scheduled visit and found the situation more complicated than a simple headline could capture. David was not a cruel man. He was an exhausted one, caught in a gap between systems that were supposed to help families like his, and consistently failed to. The county's respite program had a wait list that outlasted most crises. The Disability Support Office had shuffled Douglas's file between 3 different caseworkers in 2 years, each restart requiring new paperwork, new interviews, new delays. David had asked for help through every official channel available to him, and every channel had, in its own bureaucratic way, told him to wait. Diane's report reflected that nuance. She noted plainly that David had reached out for help long before Raymond ever stopped his motorcycle, and that the system, not the man, had failed to answer. Still, the county required immediate action regardless of intent. She informed David that Douglas would need a documented safety plan within 2 weeks, consistent supervision, an emergency contact list, and proof of a sustainable caregiving arrangement. Or the case would be escalated toward considering alternative placement. The words alternative placement landed on David like a physical blow. He sat at the kitchen table after Diane left, staring at nothing, and Douglas, sensing something was wrong even without understanding the details, came and sat beside him. "Are you sad?" Douglas asked. "A little," David admitted, which was more honesty than he usually allowed himself in front of his nephew. "I'm scared they're gonna take you somewhere else." Douglas considered this with the same careful seriousness he gave most things. "I don't want to go somewhere else," he said. "I like it here. I like Charlie the gnome, and I like Raymond." That evening, Raymond came by as he'd said he would, this time with Pamela Reyes and a folder of information about respite care programs she'd compiled from her hospice work contacts. What started as an offer of help slowly became something closer to a campaign. Word had spread through the Blue Ridge Riders network, exactly as promised, and within a week, the 700-strong phone tree had produced real, tangible support. A retired special education teacher named Kathleen Ferris volunteered to spend 3 afternoons a week with Douglas, teaching him basic budgeting and helping him practice job interview skills. A rider named Stephen Kowalski, who ran a small auto detailing shop, offered David a better-paying second job with flexible hours that didn't require overnight shifts. A local attorney reviewed David's guardianship paperwork for free and discovered that Douglas actually qualified for a state waiver program that David had never been told about, one that would fund up to 20 hours a week of in-home support. But not everyone in the group agreed on the right path forward, and the disagreement became its own kind of complication. Marcus Webb believed firmly that Douglas would be safer and happier in a supervised group home with trained staff, arguing that David, however well-meaning, had already proven the arrangement could fail catastrophically under pressure. Raymond disagreed just as firmly, insisting that ripping Douglas away from the only family and home he'd known would cause a different, deeper kind of harm. That the goal should be building enough support around David and Douglas together, that neither of them had to face this alone again. The tension between the two men grew sharp enough that at one gathering in Marcus's garage, their voices rose loud enough for Pamela to step between them. "This isn't about who's right," she said, cutting through the noise. "It's about what Douglas actually wants. Has anybody asked him?" The room went quiet. It was, Raymond realized with a flush of shame, a question nobody had thought to ask directly. They had all been so busy deciding what was best for Douglas that they had nearly forgotten to include him in deciding it with them. 2 days later, at a small meeting arranged with Diane Whitfield, David, Raymond, Kathleen, and a support coordinator sitting around the kitchen table, Douglas was asked plainly what he wanted. He took his time answering, the way he always did, folding and unfolding his hands. "I want to stay with Uncle David," he said finally, "but I don't want to be tied up anymore. I want Kathleen to keep teaching me things. And I want Raymond to keep coming on Saturdays because that's my favorite day now." It was, in its simplicity, the clearest guiding statement anyone in that kitchen had heard in weeks, and it reframed the entire plan. Diane agreed to draft the safety proposal around exactly that. David remaining primary guardian, supported by the newly discovered state waiver funding 20 hours of weekly in-home assistance, Kathleen continuing her afternoon sessions, and a rotating group of Blue Ridge Riders volunteers, coordinated now with actual structure instead of improvised goodwill, filling in gaps on evenings and weekends. Marcus remained uneasy about the arrangement, worried it still placed too much weight on informal volunteer support that could crumble again if people's enthusiasm faded. He voiced this concern openly at the next chapter meeting, and rather than dismissing it, the group took the criticism seriously. They agreed to formalize their involvement, creating a standing rotation with backup names, monthly check-ins, and a small emergency fund specifically earmarked for the Sanders household, so that no single person's bad week could ever again leave Douglas alone and unsupported on a porch step in the summer heat. For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, David slept a full 8 hours on a Tuesday night, knowing that on Wednesday afternoon, Kathleen would be there at 3 o'clock sharp, and that if anything went wrong, an entire network of people who now knew Douglas's name stood ready to answer. 6 weeks after Raymond first stopped his motorcycle outside the house on Birchwood Lane, the case reached a formal review hearing at the County Family Services Office. A step Diane Whitfield had explained was standard procedure whenever a safety concern involving a vulnerable adult had drawn this much public attention. It was not a courtroom in the dramatic sense Douglas had imagined from television, just a plain conference room with a long table and a woman named Brenda Coyle from the county's Adult Protective Services Division sitting at the head of it, reviewing the file with a stern, unreadable expression. David wore his one good shirt, the collar slightly too tight from weight he'd lost during weeks of stress. Douglas sat beside him in a folding chair, wearing the blue button-down Kathleen had helped him pick out, gripping a small index card in his hands that Kathleen had helped him prepare. Not because he needed a script, but because having something to hold steadied him when rooms felt too quiet and too full of adults deciding things. Brenda Coyle began by reading a summary of the initial incident aloud, and Douglas felt his stomach tighten at hearing the rope, the fence post, the hours in the sun described in flat, clinical language. He glanced sideways at David, whose jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped beneath his ear. Kathleen, seated just behind them, gave Douglas's shoulder a small, steady squeeze, and he remembered the breathing exercise she had taught him for exactly this kind of moment. "Mr. Sanders," Brenda said, looking up from the file, "the department takes incidents like this seriously, regardless of intent. I need you to understand that. But I also have 6 weeks of documentation here showing significant, sustained change. A waiver program now in place, a documented care rotation, a special education volunteer, and what appears to be an unusually robust community support structure. That doesn't happen by accident. Walk me through how this came together." David tried to speak and found his voice cracking on the first sentence. It was Raymond, seated 2 chairs down among a small group of Blue Ridge riders who had come to show support, who spoke up before David could stumble further. "Ma'am, if I could," Raymond said, and Brenda nodded for him to continue. "I found Douglas by accident, but nothing that happened after was an accident. Every person in this room, and about 600 more who couldn't fit, showed up because David didn't hide what happened. He answered every hard question the county asked him. He said yes to every program that showed up, even when it meant admitting in front of strangers that he couldn't do this alone. That's not somebody looking for an easy way out. That's somebody who ran out of road and kept walking anyway." Brenda's expression didn't soften entirely, but something in her posture eased. She turned to Douglas directly, her tone shifting into something more careful. "Douglas, I want to hear from you too, if you're comfortable. Do you feel safe at home now?" Douglas looked down at his index card, though he didn't need to read it. "I used to be scared when the sun was too hot," he said slowly. "Now Kathleen comes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and Raymond comes on Saturdays, and sometimes Pamela comes too. Nobody ties me to the fence anymore. I have my own key now, so I can go inside whenever I want." He paused, gathering the next thought carefully. Uncle David was really tired before. I don't think he knew how to ask for help, but now lots of people know, and they help him too, not just me. The room was quiet for a long moment. Even Brenda, who had sat through hundreds of hearings like this one, seemed to set aside her clinical distance for just a beat, studying Douglas the way a person studies something they hadn't expected to be moved by. She made a final note in the file, then closed it. "The department's recommendation," she said, "is to maintain the current arrangement, with quarterly check-ins for the next year and continued access to the waiver services already in place. Mr. Sanders, I'll also be forwarding your case to a state advocacy group that specifically monitors gaps like the ones that led here, because, frankly, you shouldn't have had to build this safety net out of strangers on motorcycles. That's a failure on the system's part as much as anything else." Outside afterward, in the parking lot, David turned to Raymond and, for the first time since they'd met, allowed himself to say aloud what he'd been too proud and too ashamed to admit before. "I thought people like you were going to save Douglas from me," he said. "Took me a while to understand you were trying to help both of us." Raymond shook his hand and, unexpectedly, pulled him into a brief, firm hug. "Nobody saves anybody alone," Raymond said. "That's kind of the whole point." Douglas, standing between them with the late afternoon sun catching the chrome of a dozen motorcycles parked along the curb, tugged at Raymond's sleeve. "Can I ride on the back sometime?" he asked. "Not today, but sometime?" Raymond laughed, a real warm laugh that seemed to release something he'd been holding since the day he first saw that rope. "Sometime," he agreed. "I'll get you a helmet with your name on it." That evening, the Blue Ridge riders gathered at Marcus Webb's garage for what had, without anyone officially deciding it, become a weekly tradition. A cookout, a check-in, a chance for Douglas to sit among people who had learned his favorite jokes and his particular way of laughing before a punchline even landed. Marcus, who had pushed hardest for a different outcome weeks earlier, found himself flipping burgers beside Douglas at the grill, letting the younger man tell him, in careful and delighted detail, exactly how long to cook each side. "You were right to push us," Marcus admitted quietly to Raymond later that night. "I still think the system's too fragile if it relies on us. But I was wrong that taking him away was the answer. Watching him tonight? That's not a kid who needed rescuing from his family. He needed a family big enough to hold what one man alone couldn't." Raymond looked across the yard, where Douglas was showing Kathleen a magic trick with a deck of cards Pamela had given him, and Stephen was helping David adjust the tension on a new lock system for the front door. Nothing to keep Douglas in, only ever to keep him safe and free, to come and go as he wished. 700 people, Raymond said softly. "Turns out that's exactly how many it takes." Autumn came to Asheville slower than most places, the mountains holding on to green a few weeks longer than the valleys below. But by the time the maples along Birchwood Lane began turning at the edges, the house at the end of the street looked different in ways that had nothing to do with the season. The fence post by the mailbox was the same weathered grey it had always been, but there was no rope on it anymore, not even coiled up somewhere out of habit. Instead, someone, Stephen, most likely, with his auto shop toolkit, had installed a small motion sensor porch light and a new lock with a keypad, so Douglas could come and go through the front door on his own whenever he liked, without needing anyone to let him in or out. Douglas had a job now, 3 afternoons a week, sorting inventory at Stephen's detailing shop, a task Kathleen had helped him train for over the summer, using color-coded bins and a checklist he'd nearly memorized by heart. He liked the work. He liked being handed a task, completing it fully, and seeing the shelf look right by the end of his shift. Stephen told anyone who'd listened that Douglas was the most reliable employee he'd ever had, never once late, never once cutting a corner. David had cut back to one job, the flexible position Stephen had first offered him weeks earlier, and though money was still tight, it was tight in the ordinary way most families' money was tight, not in the desperate, cornered way it had been before. He slept most nights now. He had started going to a support group for caregivers of adults with disabilities, something Diane Whitfield had recommended, and something he'd resisted for weeks before finally showing up, sitting quietly in the back row until, eventually, he was the one other newcomers turned to for advice. The quarterly check-in with the county had gone smoothly in September, Brenda Coyle noting in her file that the household showed sustained stability and a support network unusually resistant to single points of failure. A phrase that made Diane smile when she read it aloud to Raymond over the phone, since it was, in its dry, bureaucratic way, exactly the outcome 600 and some phone calls had been built to produce. On the second Saturday of October, the Blue Ridge Riders held their annual charity run, a 50-mile loop through the Blue Ridge Parkway that raised money for a rotating list of local causes. This year, for the first time, the destination cause was different, a fund the chapter had created and named, after some debate, and Douglas's own enthusiastic input, the Fence Post Fund, intended to provide emergency respite grants to families caught in exactly the kind of gap that had nearly cost David and Douglas everything. Douglas rode on the back of Raymond's motorcycle for the first time that morning, wearing a helmet Raymond had ordered custom months earlier, his name stitched in careful block letters along the strap. Douglas. He had talked about the ride for weeks beforehand, asking Kathleen nearly every session whether he was ready, whether it would be scary, whether he'd get to wave at people along the road. When the morning finally came, he stood in the driveway in his jeans and jacket, practically vibrating with a mixture of nerves and delight that made David's throat tighten as he watched from the porch. "You sure about this?" David asked Raymond quietly, the old worry surfacing out of habit, even though he trusted the man completely by now. "He's been practicing getting on and off for 2 weeks in my driveway," Raymond said. "He knows the signals, he knows to lean with the turns, and I'm not going a mile over the limit the whole way. He's ready." David nodded, swallowing hard, and watched as Raymond helped Douglas onto the seat behind him, checking the helmet strap twice. guiding his hands to the proper grip points on the frame. As the engine rumbled to life beneath them, Douglas let out a whoop of pure, uncomplicated joy that carried down the whole length of Birchwood Lane. And David found himself laughing despite the tears in his eyes, waving until the motorcycle turned the corner and disappeared from sight. The ride wound through 50 miles of turning leaves, past overlooks where the valleys spread out gold and red beneath a pale October sky, Douglas leaning gently into each curve exactly as he'd been taught, his arms wrapped securely around Raymond's middle, grinning the entire way. When they arrived at the rally point, a gravel lot beside a mountain diner already crowded with 100 motorcycles and growing, Douglas climbed off with Raymond's help and stood for a moment, just taking it in. The noise, the leather vests, the smell of exhaust and coffee and fried food, the sheer scale of people who had, in one way or another, become part of his life because of a rope and a stranger and a phone call that had rippled outward until it touched hundreds of lives. Marcus Webb found him first, clapping a hand on his shoulder and asking how the ride had been. And within minutes, Douglas was surrounded by riders wanting to hear the story firsthand, wanting to shake his hand, wanting simply to be near the boy whose name had, over one long summer, become something the whole chapter carried with them, like a promise kept. Later that afternoon, as the crowd gathered for the check presentation, the day's ride, having raised enough to fund respite grants for 11 families identified through the same county office that had once nearly separated Douglas from his home, Marcus asked Douglas if he wanted to say a few words. Douglas hadn't prepared anything, no index card this time, but he walked up anyway, took the microphone with both hands, and looked out at the crowd of leather vests and sunburned faces that had become, without any of them quite planning it, his family. "I used to think nobody would notice if something happened to me," he said, his voice carrying clear and steady across the lot. "Now, I know 700 people would. That's not a number anymore. That's just who my friends are." The applause that followed rolled across the gravel lot like distant thunder, and Raymond, standing near the back, with his arms crossed and his eyes suspiciously bright, thought that if anyone had told him 6 months earlier that a Thursday ride down Birchwood Lane would lead him here, he wouldn't have believed a word of it. But then, he thought, watching Douglas laugh as 3 different riders tried to get the next dance at the makeshift party that followed, some of the best things in life arrived exactly like that, uninvited, unplanned, and impossible to imagine wanting to live without. David watched a video of the speech that Kathleen sent him later that night, sitting alone at the kitchen table where a rope had once been the only tool he had left. He played it twice, and then he called Raymond not because anything was wrong, but simply to say thank you, a phrase that had once felt too small for what these people had given his family, but which he was learning slowly was exactly the right size when it was said often enough by enough people to enough people in return. Outside, the fence post stood bare in the porch light, holding nothing but the weight of an ordinary autumn evening, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, that was more than enough.